Lewis Hamilton is returning to Mercedes. But have you heard why he's choosing to announce it this Friday, August 8th? And here's the real question. Is he stepping back in this season, or holding out until 2026? If you want every detail behind the drama, this is the video you need to see. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. Lewis Hamilton is not just making a return to Mercedes. He's igniting a renaissance, a resurgence cloaked not in nostalgia but in vengeance, hunger and precision. This is not about coming home. This is about coming back, with unfinished business, unresolved fury, and a kind of clarity that only comes from being repeatedly underestimated by the very machine he helped build. His decision to rejoin the Silver Arrows isn't some headline for the archives. It's a tectonic shift. A pulse that will reverberate through every garage, every boardroom, every paddock meeting whispered behind closed doors. The date, Friday, August 8th, isn't a PR stunt or a media circus tailored for clicks. It's a fracture line. A carefully orchestrated rupture designed to disorient, to unsettle, to send ripples of disruption across the sport's fragile political surface. Why now? Why with this level of intensity? Because timing in Formula One has never been about clocks. It's about momentum. It's about control. And Hamilton, for the first time in years, is ripping back the controls, not just of a car, but of his own narrative. This announcement isn't a press release. It's an exorcism. It's the shedding of years of red fabric and branding constraints that never truly matched the man beneath. This is Hamilton uncaged, unchained, unfiltered. A man who no longer owes the media his diplomacy, who no longer gives paddock politics the benefit of the doubt. This isn't about the 2026 season. It's not about contracts. It's about soul. About reclaiming the edge, the danger, the wrath that made him great. The question isn't whether he waits. The question is whether Formula One can even contain him between now and then. Because the way he's moving, the way this message has landed, it's already destabilizing the grid. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. There are whispers. Some say he could take the wheel before the ink on 2025 is even dry. Some insist he'll finish his obligations at Ferrari with class, with grace, with restraint. But they forget who he is now. They forget what silence can do to a man who has tasted betrayal not from enemies, but from the hands he once trusted most. What if this isn't about waiting anymore? What if the physics of this choice can't be delayed? What if Mercedes sees the storm building and decides the only logical step is to unleash it early, to weaponize it before another season is wasted? Because make no mistake, this isn't a return to a team. It's a reclamation of territory, of identity, of dominance. And it's layered in symbolism. The prodigal son who was never truly a prodigal, because he never lost his edge. He was simply miscast, mishandled, misunderstood. He watched Ferrari fumble legacy after legacy, listened to promises that echoed but never landed, and stood by as strategy after strategy collapsed under the weight of their own indecision. And through it all, he smiled. He played the role. He endured. Until he didn't have to anymore. Now, the gloves are off. The chessboard is flipped. The storm has a target. The Hamilton who returns to Brackley is not the Hamilton who left. He carries scars now, but they're not weaknesses, they're coordinates. And every scar points back to the same thing: truth. Mercedes doesn't just get a driver back. They get the truth incarnate. They get the version of Lewis that remembers every slight, every snub, every race sabotaged by chaos not of his making. And this time, he's not here to inspire. He's here to dismantle. So what happens next? The answer isn't in a press conference or an Instagram post. It's in the shifting body language of paddock figures who suddenly look unsure. It's in the back-channel phone calls between CEOs and engineers who now wonder if they backed the wrong revolution. It's in the quiet terror seeping through teams who know exactly what Lewis Hamilton can do in a car built to his specs, guided by minds that understand not just his talent but his rage. This move isn't just a return, it's a warning shot. What if he shows up before Abu Dhabi 2025 with the silver fire already burning? What if negotiations behind the scenes are not about timing but about leverage? What if Toto Wolff's grin on camera isn't excitement, but a knowing smirk because the plan was never 2026, it was always as soon as possible? What if the Hamilton era never ended, it was merely paused, diverted, delayed by the weight of history and expectation? What if the sport's greatest warrior has spent 2 years in disguise, waiting for the moment when he could step back into the arena not as a symbol, but as a threat? He's not selling inspiration anymore. He's selling results. And he's making it very clear, he doesn't need Ferrari's legacy, because he is the legacy. And the very idea that he might finish the season in red before slipping into silver again feels, suddenly, obsolete. Like asking a lion to stay caged just one more day. Because when the roar starts, when the lights go out, when the visor drops, it won't be about the past anymore. It will be about who controls the future. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. And right now, that answer is no longer unclear. It's loud. It's lethal. And it wears number 44. He said nothing for months. No statements, no leaks, no suggestive emojis dropped into conveniently timed tweets. No cryptic radio silence suddenly interrupted by subtle hints planted in journalist columns. There were no unnamed sources whispering to media insiders. No sly nods from team principals in post-race conferences. There were no teasing helmet changes. No sudden unfollows on social media to spark speculation. No cleverly orchestrated press tours with carefully measured words. Nothing. Just quiet. Deafening. Deliberate. Calculating silence. And then, one image. One grayscale photo. Stark, unedited, unapologetic. A portrait, not of fame, not of legacy, but of identity. Of resistance. The eyes didn't plead for attention, they dared you to look deeper. Not into the man the world had dressed in myth, but the one it had tried to erase behind red uniforms and public platitudes. The caption didn't shout. It didn't sell. It cut. 8 words, unadorned and undeniable. Home is where the respect lives. I'm coming back. A whisper delivered with the weight of thunder. No hashtags. No sponsors tagged. No grand declarations of partnerships or purpose. Just raw, unfiltered clarity. A personal revolution compressed into a sentence. And then the world cracked. Phones buzzed with disbelief. Timelines flooded like breached levees. And headlines scrambled to catch up to a truth that didn't need confirming. It wasn't news. It was a reckoning. And what made it powerful wasn't surprise, but inevitability. This wasn't a twist, it was a long overdue correction. A tectonic shift hidden in plain sight all along, felt in every wordless walk past Ferrari engineers, in every icy podium glance, in every deflected question answered with a hollow diplomacy of a man biding time. The clues weren't missing. We just hadn't dared believe them. Lewis Hamilton didn't return to the team that once defined him. He reclaimed it. He didn't knock. He kicked the damn door off the hinges. This wasn't a comeback. This was a purge. He didn't return to be loved. He returned to be heard. To make sure that the next chapter of his story would no longer be written by PR teams, corporate strategists, or image consultants smoothing out edges for broader market appeal. That story is over. The sequel begins now, and this time the pen is firmly in his hand. Ferrari thought they had silenced him with status. They mistook reverence for loyalty. They thought that wrapping him in heritage would make him forget who he was. But Hamilton never forgot. Every press release that painted over conflict with cliches only added more weight to the volcano building inside him. Every meeting where he was praised but ignored only sharpened his focus. They thought he was playing the long game to win a title. He was playing the long game to win back himself. What we saw in that photo wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't marketing. It wasn't even a warning. It was a man stepping out of the shadow of compromise. He had worn the suit, smiled the smile, shaken the hands, and stood for the anthem of a team that never truly saw him. But while they were crafting a narrative, he was building a truth. One forged in private, in pain, in patience. Ferrari gave him a car. But Mercedes gave him voice, purpose, memory, belonging. This is not the return of a champion. It is the revenge of a legacy. He endured silence, but not passively. He listened, watched, calculated. He saw himself being molded into something he never agreed to become, a brand without a boundary, a figurehead without force, a global icon softened into a digestible product. The world kept asking if he was okay. They missed the point. He was never okay. Not after the promises turned into politics. Not after the smiles turned into stares. Not after the passion turned into performance reviews. Hamilton's silence wasn't absence. It was a decision. A strategic withdrawal from the noise, from the theater of pretending. Ferrari didn't lose him because of failure. They lost him because they never truly had him. They had his image, but not his fire. His statistics, but not his soul. They mistook proximity for partnership. And now they're watching the truth walk away, grayer, wiser, and more dangerous than ever. What Mercedes is getting back is not just a driver. They're receiving a weapon. A voice sharpened by erasure, powered by injustice, and focused like never before. They're not welcoming a man hoping to reclaim past glory. They're unleashing one who has seen the system from the inside, survived its coldest rooms, and chosen to burn down the parts that buried him in red. This isn't closure. It's ignition. He's not coming back to finish something. He's coming back to begin what should have been allowed to bloom years ago. And this time, he's not asking for permission. He's not waiting for support. He doesn't need narrative architects. He doesn't need redemption arcs. He doesn't even need a title. What he needs is space. What he needs is truth. What he needs is what he never stopped being, the soul of the storm. And the paddock? It's not ready. Because this Hamilton, this version that emerged from the ruins of diplomacy and design, from the dust of being made a passenger in his own story, he isn't returning to entertain. He's returning to dismantle. To reset the terms of engagement. To be heard without filter, respected without condition, and feared without apology. And he won't blink. He won't flinch. He won't soften his edges for comfort. Because for the first time in years, Lewis Hamilton is not performing. He's arriving. To the outside world, it was painted as the perfect alignment of greatness, a seamless union between one of Formula One's most iconic teams and one of the most successful drivers in history. The red of Ferrari and the legacy of Lewis Hamilton created a visual so powerful, so emotionally charged, that millions believed it was the beginning of a new golden era. Fans clung to the dream, journalists romanticized every gesture, and the paddock whispered of dynasties yet to be built. But beyond the red-painted smiles, far from the camera lenses and choreographed handshakes, a far more complex and painful truth unraveled with every passing race weekend. From the very beginning, there was a quiet dissonance. While the world celebrated the signing, internally, the gears turned slowly and stubbornly. Hamilton arrived not only with talent, but with a lifetime of experience, a vault of championship instincts, and a rare ability to feel what a car needed before the sensors even registered it. But rather than being embraced, his knowledge was often parked in inboxes, unread and unexplored. His voice, once the guiding rhythm of dominant seasons at Mercedes, became background chatter in a room deafened by tradition and hierarchy. Maranello didn't bend, it resisted. The institution that once forged legends had become so consumed by its own mythology that it couldn't see the living legend in its midst. Lewis never came to play the diva. He didn't demand deference or ask to be placed on a pedestal. He came with open hands and clear eyes, seeking dialogue, growth, and collaboration. But Ferrari, still shackled by decades of internal power struggles, political undercurrents, and an almost religious reverence for how things have always been, struggled to adapt to the kind of partnership Hamilton was offering. They wanted a figurehead. He offered a mind. They wanted a poster boy. He offered a brain wired for speed, innovation, and precision. The engineers listened, but only enough to write meeting notes. The strategists nodded, but only long enough to move to the next bullet point. What should have been a revolution in red became a stagnation masked in press releases. Slowly, Ferrari began to do what no team had ever dared: reduce Lewis Hamilton to a name in a media kit, a face for their branding, a symbol without substance. He wasn't being driven out, but he was being slowly erased. And still he fought. He gave every ounce of himself, race after race. He didn't show up late. He didn't disengage. He didn't quit. He showed up earlier, worked harder, analyzed deeper. When the car lacked grip, he gave feedback so rich it could have rewritten an entire aero philosophy. When the pit wall blundered, he didn't berate, he recalibrated. When the politics got loud, he remained poised. He carried not just his legacy, but the weight of hopes that maybe, just maybe, Ferrari could be more than its history. Maybe it could become a team that built the future with boldness, not bureaucracy. But change never came. The warmth he brought began to cool. His laughter in the garage became rarer. The sparkle in his post-session debriefs turned into restrained politeness. The The driver who once lit up every room with a presence that demanded respect, attention, and inspiration began fading. Not from lack of effort, but from exhaustion. He wasn't just racing anymore. He was surviving a system that refused to evolve. And then the illusion shattered, not with a crash or a dramatic team radio, but with a sentence. Cold. Sharp. Precise. Charles is the benchmark. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't even delivered with malice. It was clinical. A sentence, rehearsed, sanitized, and injected into the room like a tranquilizer dart. And in that moment, beneath the clinical white lights and hum of data servers in the Austrian GP briefing room, something snapped, not in anger, but in quiet realization. He had not been misunderstood. He had been overlooked, misjudged, misused, and most painfully, discarded as a strategic asset in favor of a narrative that suited their internal comfort zones. The message beneath those 4 words was deafening. Not just that he was second best. Not just that his experience was disposable. But that the battle for influence within the team was over, and he had lost. They weren't looking for leadership. They were looking for compliance. They weren't building a legacy with him. They were writing him out of it. That night, the mask slipped. Not for the world, but for him. The dream, the chance to rebuild a legend with Ferrari, had dissolved. He didn't storm out. He didn't confront anyone. He simply saw it for what it was. And once a man sees the truth, it cannot be unseen. Yet in the days that followed, he still put on the suit. Still showed up. Still drove. Because that's who he is. A warrior of the asphalt. But behind the visor now lived a man who knew the score. Knew the script had already been written. Knew that redemption would not come wearing red. And somewhere, deep inside the paddock, whispers began again. Not of championships, but of exits. Not of strategy meetings, but of phone calls to Brackley. Not of the future in red, but of a return to silver. And this time, he wasn't coming back to be part of something. He was coming back to finish something. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't let anger spill into the room. He simply looked them in the eye and let the truth fall like a blade. I didn't come here to play second fiddle. I'm not a background act. I'm an 8-time world champion. There was no desperation, no histrionics, no attempt to provoke. Just the kind of piercing, exacting truth that makes silence louder than screams. In that instant, the air changed. The tension didn't explode, it crystallized. The message was clear. He wasn't begging for respect. He was reclaiming it. It wasn't a rebellion. It was a reckoning. That sentence, delivered with surgical calm, sliced through every illusion Ferrari had tried to preserve. The carefully staged photo ops, the ceremonial smiles, the rehearsed lines about equal treatment and shared ambitions, they all crumbled under the weight of reality. Ferrari, a name that evokes myth and majesty, had extended their hand to Hamilton but had kept their guard up the entire time. They had welcomed the legend, but not the leader. They wanted the spotlight he brought, but not the direction he might demand. They applauded the champion, but muzzled the man. And he noticed. Slowly, painfully, he began to see the contours of a truth too bitter to swallow all at once. It didn't hit him like a thunderbolt, it crept in like a cold wind. He felt it in the closed-door meetings, where his insights were acknowledged but never integrated. He felt it during strategy debriefs, when suggestions from the other side of the garage somehow took precedence. He felt it in the lack of urgency around his setups, in the priority calls that seemed to drift elsewhere, in the subtle shift in tone whenever he questioned a directive. It wasn't a single betrayal. It was erosion. In Silverstone, he stood on his home soil and heard the thunder of 100,000 fans scream his name, but inside the garage, he heard only restraint. That weekend, he drove like a man possessed, feeding off the energy of a nation, but when he stepped out of the car, he was met not with celebration, but with indifference masquerading as professionalism. There were no accusations, no confrontations. Just a chilling sense that something fundamental was missing, belief. In Montreal, it became impossible to ignore. His pace was strong. His instincts sharp. But the team's decisions were sluggish, uncertain, misaligned. They called him in too late. Left him out too long. It was as if invisible hands had shifted the balance against him, not through sabotage, but through systemic resistance. The machinery of Ferrari, so revered from the outside, had become a labyrinth of subtle dismissals and strategic silence. It wasn't the opponents on track who damaged his race. It was the people in his own garage, the engineers who hesitated, the strategists who doubted, the leadership that didn't lead. The realization didn't break him. It refined him. He stopped looking for signs of change. Stopped waiting for the atmosphere to shift. Instead, he watched. He listened. And when the final puzzle piece clicked into place, not with drama, but with certainty, he acted. No press release. No storming out. Just quiet precision. He picked up his phone. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment gesture. He had looked at that name in his contacts many times before, always stopping just short of dialing. But this time, there was no hesitation. The name, Toto Wolf, was more than a contact. It was an anchor to a time when his voice was heard, his vision trusted, his spirit protected. The call rang once. Twice. Then that familiar Austrian calm answered. No pleasantries, no small talk. Just two men who had lived through triumph and turmoil, now reconnecting not because of nostalgia, but necessity. "They don't see me anymore," Hamilton said, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and truth. He didn't need to explain. Because Toto already knew. Not the specifics, but the feeling. The erosion of respect. The quiet dismissal of greatness. The loneliness of being the most decorated driver in the room and still feeling invisible. "And with a calm that only comes from knowing exactly who you're talking to," Toto replied, "then come home." It wasn't about going backward. It wasn't about reliving glory days. It was about returning to a place where his worth wasn't questioned, where his instincts were not only welcomed but sharpened, where his excellence wasn't ornamental, it was essential. The conversation didn't last long. It didn't need to. Every sentence was a nod to shared battles, every pause a recognition of trust. When the call ended, Hamilton wasn't just leaving Ferrari. He was reclaiming himself. He didn't announce it with a flourish. He didn't turn his exit into a spectacle. He let the silence speak. Let the paddock feel the tremor of what was about to come. Let the headlines swirl while he walked forward. The move wasn't a retaliation, it was a rebirth. And as whispers turned into headlines, and headlines into seismic shifts, those who once doubted his fire were forced to reckon with its return. Because Lewis Hamilton didn't leave Ferrari out of anger. He left because greatness does not negotiate its value. It simply moves on when it is no longer seen. That night in Vienna didn't carry the polished weight of a formal negotiation, nor the strategic coldness of a business transaction. There were no agents, no legal teams, no cameras waiting outside luxury hotels. There were no statements prepared, no bullet points to address, no media-friendly handshakes to orchestrate. It was something rawer, something older. It was a moment carved not from protocol, but from legacy. Two men entered that quiet room not as representatives of brands or institutions, but as architects of one of the greatest dynasties motorsport has ever seen, standing face to face again after what felt like a lifetime of noise, separation, and unfinished sentences. Lewis Hamilton didn't walk into that room wearing bravado. There was no armor of celebrity, no trace of the polished icon carefully curated for public consumption. He came as a man stripped bare by time, by pressure, by the weight of choices made and unmade. He didn't speak first, not because of hesitation, but because he knew the gravity of what was about to be set in motion. When he finally did speak, there was no mention of salary brackets, championship incentives, or branding percentages. His voice carried something deeper, an echo of the battlefield, a plea not for glory, but for purpose. He told Toto Wolff that he was tired of being a symbol. He didn't want to be a monument to past victories, or a figurehead for corporate agendas. He wanted the sweat, the grit, the fight. He didn't want the crown. He wanted the sword. No glamour. No filters. No illusions. Just a seat, a machine, and the chance to write the final chapter on his own terms. One more campaign, not as the king returning to reclaim a throne, but as the soldier who never got to end his war. Toto understood. He didn't need charts or projections. He didn't need to look at data or consult a boardroom. He looked at the man in front of him, his friend, his champion, the soul of their silver empire, and he recognized the fire. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't regret. It was inevitability. What they began building that night was not a comeback. It was a confrontation with time itself. A second act not born from desperation, but from an unfinished masterpiece demanding its final brushstroke. And the world had no idea. Until now. On the morning of August 8th, the silence shattered. Not with the blaring of media outlets or the soundbites of executives, but with something more potent. A photo. Singular. Stark. Lewis Hamilton, standing still yet carrying the weight of acceleration in his posture. A silver suit, not redesigned, not rebranded, familiar, almost hauntingly so. The kind of suit you don't just wear. The kind of suit that remembers. Behind him, the garage wasn't pristine. It wasn't curated. It was aged by memory, soaked in echoes, the scent of burnt rubber, the ghosts of past triumphs, the faint lingering vibration of 7 world titles etched into its walls. And beneath the image, just 7 words, casually displayed, yet heavy enough to stop time. Coming home. 2026. Let's finish this right. There were no fireworks. No exclusive interviews. No behind-the-scenes documentaries queued up for digital premieres. Just that image, and those words. And they detonated. Within minutes, the motorsport world felt it, not as news, but as a rupture. As if something long dormant had been reawakened beneath the tarmac of every circuit. Fans weren't reading headlines. They were feeling tremors. Team principals paused mid-call. Drivers in simulators lost focus. Engineers at wind tunnels blinked at their screens. A ripple turned into a wave, then into a storm. And then came Mercedes. Just 3 words. That's all they needed. He's back. No hashtags. No extra context. No corporate slogans. Just those 2 words and the unmistakable presence of the 3-pointed star. It was more than a statement. It was a verdict. A warning. A whisper and a scream at once. The silence that had grown in the paddock over the past year, since Hamilton's quiet departure to Ferrari, since the headlines of disillusionment and disconnect, was suddenly broken with the clarity of steel slicing air. Because this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about rewriting history. It was about finishing it properly. This time, there would be no politics. No compromises. No distractions. Just racing. Just war. A farewell mission not drenched in sentimentality, but sharpened by precision. A final season that wouldn't be lived in the past, but aimed like a spear at the very core of the present. And those in the paddock, those who had once dismissed the possibility of his return, those who had whispered that he was done, that he had lost the hunger, they suddenly remembered who Lewis Hamilton truly was. Not a brand. Not a relic. Not a name to print on t-shirts. But the storm itself. The one who didn't need revenge, because his very presence was enough to reset the entire balance of power. Some smiled. Some panicked. And some, like Verstappen, Leclerc, Norris, and Russell, felt the invisible tightening of the battlefield around them. Because they weren't just racing each other anymore. They were racing a man who had nothing left to prove, and everything left to say. Not with words, but with laps. With overtakes. With silence followed by thunder. And as the engines warm up for what will surely be the most electrified season in recent memory, one thing is certain, the legend has returned not to be celebrated, but to complete the mission he started. On his own terms. With his own fire. Against time, against doubt, and against anyone who stands in the way of the final chapter, he came back to write with fire in his eyes and silver in his soul. Ferrari didn't release a statement. They didn't publish a video. No tribute, no applause, no final photo, no handshake. No mention of Lewis Hamilton at all. There was no carefully worded farewell post. No thank you for the memories. No acknowledgement of what had been built, what had been endured, or what had been broken. Just silence. A heavy, deliberate, intentional void. And in that silence, louder than any press release, louder than any podium ceremony or social media montage, they revealed the truth. A truth Lewis Hamilton had lived with for months. A truth he had carried alone. That his presence was tolerated, but never embraced. That the battles he fought behind the scenes were real. That the tension was not imagined. That the respect was never mutual. Their silence wasn't just a snub, it was a confession. It was the sound of discomfort, the echo of guilt, the quiet collapse of a facade that could no longer hold. They didn't need to say anything, because in saying nothing, they confirmed it all. Every cold glance. Every missed opportunity. Every moment he felt like an outsider in red. Every time he showed up, carried the weight, endured the pressure, and still gave more than was asked. The silence was their final word. And it said everything. But this moment, this chapter, this decision, it isn't about the seat he's vacating. It isn't about the car he's leaving behind. It isn't even about the next destination on the calendar. It's about reclaiming control. It's about looking at a mirror and refusing to accept the version others are trying to paint. It's about dignity. It's about integrity. It's about choosing not to be a background character in someone else's story, but the author of his own. Lewis Hamilton doesn't chase revenge. He doesn't crave validation from those who withheld it. He doesn't move out of spite. He moves because responsibility calls. Not to prove a point to Ferrari, but to prove something to himself. To show that when the world tries to rewrite your ending, you still hold the pen. And you can still choose how the last page is written. He doesn't want applause. He wants closure. Not for the world. For himself. This isn't about legacy anymore. That was cemented years ago, in wet qualifying laps that defied physics, in comeback drives that stunned the sport, in world titles lifted against the odds, in barriers broken on and off the track. This is about something deeper. It's about peace. The kind of peace that only comes when you know you didn't settle. When you didn't shrink to fit. When you stood your ground, even when it would have been easier to fade quietly. And now, Lewis Hamilton doesn't just step into another garage. He doesn't just don a new uniform. He doesn't just change teams. He steps into a storm. Into an unfinished business that refuses to be ignored. Into a reckoning that has been waiting for years. But this time, it won't be dictated by contracts or politics or PR strategies. It won't be shaped by narratives pushed by those with agendas. This time, it will unfold on his terms. With every overtake, every strategic masterstroke, every qualifying lap that silences a grandstand, he will reclaim what was always his. No longer a marketing tool. No longer a scapegoat. No longer a symbol to be used when convenient and ignored when uncomfortable. He returns as a man who knows exactly who he is. A man who has walked through shadows, endured whispers, been doubted, criticized, underestimated, and still stands. Not just intact, but stronger. The paddock may look the same. The garages may bear different logos. But the sport itself feels changed. The air is different. The weight of what's coming presses against every team principal strategy board, every engineer's simulation model, every rival's conscience. Because now they all know, the story isn't over. Not even close. The engines haven't roared to life. The lights haven't gone out. The checkered flag hasn't waved. And yet, Formula One already feels rewritten. Not by a result, but by a refusal to be erased.